In today's video, we're going to talk about dependency injection. We're going to cover more or less everything you need to know in order to integrate dependency injection in your .NET applications. My name is Amichai, and in this channel I talk about software architecture, design patterns, best practices, .NET, C#, developer tools, things that you really must be familiar with if you're a software engineer. So if that sounds interesting, then make sure to smash the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos. Okay, let's get started. So in the previous video where I talked about the fundamentals of dependency injection, we learned about the IOC container, what dependency injection is, the dependency inversion principle, etc., etc. But now let's see how you go ahead and integrate dependency injection in an actual application. So what we currently have is nothing. So this is an empty web API. So currently we don't have any endpoints, any services, nothing. And what I want us to do is to go ahead and build some service from scratch. So I'll start building it and then we'll stop. I'll explain the theory and we'll go back and forth. That way we'll cover all the various topics. So let's go ahead and create here a new folder in the root directory. And let's call this controllers. And over here, let's create the numbers controller. We'll talk about this in a minute. This, of course, will inherit from the controller base. And let's add the API controller attribute as well as the route attribute. And let's have the route simply be numbers, so let's say controller. And what we're going to have for now is a simple get endpoint. So let's say HTTP get. And let's say we're returning over here some numbers. Let's call this get number. And for now, let's simply return from here 5. Okay, so pretty simple. We call the get endpoint and we return the static number 5. Now, if we go ahead and we run the service, then we'll see that even though the service is running on port 5116, if we go ahead and we try to make a request to the correct endpoint, so the endpoint is numbers, and we're making a get request, then we get here 404 not found. And that may seem weird because we just created the controller and we defined the endpoint. But the reason why this doesn't appear is because we didn't add the controller itself to the dependency injection IOC container. So what we want to do is say builder.services, and we want to tell the ASP.NET framework to scan the assembly, find all the various controllers, and register them in the dependency injection IOC container. So for this, all we need to do is say add controllers, which will do that and some other things behind the scenes. And also because we want, when we're sending a request, for there to be some middleware which looks at the route of the request and calls or invokes the appropriate endpoint, what we want to do is go ahead and say app.mapControllers, which will do exactly that. Now that we have this, then we can go ahead and run the application again. And now when we make a request, then as expected, we get 5. Okay, now to make things a bit more interesting, let's take the generation of this number. And instead of it being a static 5, let's go ahead and put this in some numbers service, which will return a number. And that way we'll invoke that service instead of simply returning 5 over here. So let's say over here, numbers service. Imagine that this already exists, and let's say numbers service. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to say numbers service dot get number and return whatever's returned from the iNumbers service. So let's go ahead and create here a new folder, and let's call this services. And actually, before we use the interface, let's simply say numbers service, so the actual class. And over here inside the services, let's create the actual implementation of this class. And like we said, we want over here to have a method returning an int, and this will be called get number, which doesn't have any parameters. And finally, from here, let's return our number, which is 5. So now back in the controller, then we can go ahead and add the corresponding namespace and everything should compile successfully. So now if we go ahead and make the request again, what do you think will be the output? So I'm going to send the request. If you want to guess, then do it now. And we see we get an exception. Now the exception that we get is the following exception. We have an invalid operation exception where we're unable to resolve a service of type web API blah 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 numbers service while attempting to activate the numbers controller. Okay, so we're getting this exception, and what is actually happening behind the scenes is the following. The framework matches the route to the existing routes. It sees that the route matches the numbers controller and the get number endpoint, and then it goes ahead and tries to create an instance of the numbers controller class. The creation of the numbers controller class is done using the dependency injection IOC container. So just a quick reminder from the previous video. So we have the dependency injection IOC container, and we're giving this component control over the creation and management of objects. So like we said, inversion of control is giving some control to a container or a framework. In our case, we're giving the control to this container, and it's responsible for generating and managing the objects for us. Now, the reason why it's called a dependency injection IOC container is because the responsibility that it has is to also handle all the various dependency injection. So each object that has a dependency, it's also responsible to inject the dependency into that object. Now, in practicality, all the dependency injection needs to do is when we go ahead and specify some type, then it needs to return an object of that type. How? That depends on our configuration. So over here, we have the various logic that we wrote, and this will decide what object will be returned. Now, when we go ahead and we send the request, the middleware matches the route, and it sees that indeed it matches the numbers controller and the get number route. So it requests from the dependency injection IOC container, not just any type, but the numbers controller. But the numbers controller has a dependency on the numbers service. Because it has this dependency and it notices that in the constructor, it has this parameter, that it also tries to first create the numbers service and supply that as an argument. So it does some internal searching, and it sees that it doesn't have any configuration for the numbers service. Because it doesn't have any configuration for the numbers service, it doesn't know how to generate this numbers service object, and that's the exception that we get. So all we need to do really is to go to the program CS, and over here we want to go ahead and say builder.services, and for now let's say add transient, and we'll talk about transient, scoped, and singleton in a few minutes. But for now let's just say add transient, and let's specify the numbers service like so. Once we have that and we let the service run again, then this should work as expected. And indeed, as we can see, we get OK, and we invoked the numbers service successfully. Now, real quick before we continue, I want to remind you that I have 3 comprehensive courses on DomeTrain. 2 of them are a 0 to hero in clean architecture, which comprise, in my opinion, the most comprehensive course for building production-ready applications following clean architecture, including tests, authorization, everything you need to know when you're building production applications, and also another course on domain-driven design, which also I don't think there's another comprehensive course like this course that teaches you everything you need to know to get started with domain-driven design. So all the various terminology, various concepts, core concepts, and principles that you need to know when you're working with domain-driven design. So if you enjoy these videos, you want to expand your knowledge on clean architecture and domain-driven design, and you want to see more of this on your screen, then make sure to check out the link in the description. Now back to the video. Now, what we're using here by default, this services, is simply the IServiceCollection, which is the default dependency injection IOC container that we get as part of the .NET ecosystem. What we can actually do, if we just get rid of all of this, we can go ahead and say .NET add package and specify the Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection package. And once we have that, then we can simply do the following. We can say service collection and say services. We can initialize this. We could add to the service collection both the controller and the service. So we can go ahead and say add transient and specify the numbers controller. And then we can go ahead and also add the numbers service. And once we have both of these, we can go ahead and build the service provider. So let's say service provider. And then we can go ahead and say service provider, please give me an instance of the service numbers controller. And this will go ahead and create an instance of the numbers controller class. Plus it'll inject the numbers service dependency. And then once we have this, then we have the controller, and we can go ahead and call the get number endpoint. And finally, let's dump this to the screen. Let me just add the package dumpify. Okay, once we have that, then we can go ahead, add the dumpify namespace. And now if we go ahead and watch run this again, then we can see a bit of the behavior that happens behind the scenes where the dependency injection IOC container creates a new instance of the numbers controller, injects the numbers service, and simply invokes the corresponding endpoint. And over here, we can see that we have the output being 5, and we have here some extra information because we're returning an OK object result. Okay, so now that we have this very basic understanding and intuition regarding how this works, let's go ahead and make things a bit more interesting. The first thing I'm going to do, just for clarity, is I'm going to create here an empty scope, and I'm going to put 2 of these inside here. So we have a clear separation between the various registrations and the request pipeline. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about what this transient part is. So basically, like we said, we're creating this dependency injection IOC container, and we're playing with the configuration over here. Now we go ahead and request some type. When we say transient, then we're telling the dependency injection IOC container every single time someone requests a numbers service, go ahead and create a brand new numbers service and return that. So again, transient basically says every single time someone requests a numbers service, go ahead and generate a brand new number service object. Okay, now to see this in action, let's go ahead and update the number service, and instead of simply returning 5, let's say that it has a private read-only integer, and this will be the underlying number that will be returned. So over here, instead of returning 5, then it will return this number. And to put some random number in this number, let's say that when we create a new instance of the number service, we go ahead and we generate a number and store it in the field. So let's say over here, new random, and let's generate a new number between, let's say, 0 and 100. So now, once the service is up and running, we can go ahead and fetch the number, and one time we get 5, and we can see that every time we get a different number. And the reason for that is that inside the dependency injection IOC container, we have a configuration both for the controllers and for the number service that they should be created in a transitive manner. Meaning that when we go ahead and we make a request, the dependency injection IOC container says, okay, I need to create a controller. What lifetime does it have? It has a transient lifetime, meaning it'll create a brand new controller. When it goes ahead and creates this brand new controller, it also goes ahead and creates a brand new number service, because also the number service is transient. That's why we have over here these two objects that were created specifically for this request. This is what's created and given to the framework, and the framework goes ahead and invokes the corresponding endpoint. And because every time we initialize this number service, we generate a new number, then every single time we get inside here a new number, and we get a new number finally in the response to the user. Okay, now let's talk about the next lifetime, which is also pretty simple. So again, transient, creating a brand new instance every time. Instead, let's say over here, Singleton, and let's see how the behavior changes. So I'm reminding you again, all I did was change the number service from bring transient to Singleton. And now when we go ahead and make the request, then we can see we get 40, but in the next request, we also get 40, and we'll continue getting 40 forever. The reason for that is the following. Singleton tells the dependency injection IOC container, in the first time someone requests this type, in our case, it's the number service, go ahead and create the underlying object and store it. From now on, every time someone requests this type, go ahead and return this same object. Okay, so again, we go ahead and we create a single object, and this object is always going to be what's returned from the dependency injection IOC container. So when it goes ahead and creates the controller again is transient. When it goes ahead and creates the controller, every time it'll create a new controller, but the underlying number service will always be the same. So we created the very first instance of the number service. We stored inside whatever number was generated. In our case, it's 40, right? So this 40 stays there. And throughout the lifetime of the application, this object is what will be returned every time someone requests a number service. Okay, now this also means that if we had many endpoints and all these endpoints, all of them needed to use the number service, then all of them would get, again, this same instance, and all of them would eventually return the number 40. Okay, now this is where things start becoming a bit more interesting. So just to over-engineer this for the sake of the example, let's imagine that we have the following. The number service isn't the one generating the number, but as many applications have, they have a service, which the service uses some client, and the client does the API call or the underlying work to return the value that's needed. So let's say that we have over here some numbers client, and this numbers client is going to be the one that generates the actual number. So we're not going to return the number over here, but instead we're going to say numbers client dot get number, and the client will be the one generating the actual number. So let's say over here clients, and let's create over here the numbers client. And the numbers client is going to be the exact same thing. So let's go ahead and take this and put it over here. Let's also take this get number method. Let's put it over here and let's have it return the number. And now that we have that, then we can get rid of this. We can add the corresponding namespace. And what we have is we have the controller. The controller again is transient, which is calling the number service, which is currently a singleton. And this is calling the numbers client. Now, if we go ahead and run the application now, then of course we will fail because we didn't register this dependency. So when the dependency injection IOC container goes ahead and tries to create the controller, it'll look at the dependencies of the controller. It'll see it has the number service. It'll look at the number service and it'll see that it has a dependency on the numbers client. And then it'll try to create the numbers client, but this will fail because we didn't register it. So of course, the first thing we need to do is we want to go ahead and register the numbers client as well. So that's over here, numbers client. So I want you to take a moment and think, what is the lifetime that's appropriate for the numbers client? Okay, if you have an answer locked in, then this is the time to say that it really doesn't matter what the lifetime of the numbers client is going to be. So to demonstrate this, let's rerun the application. Let's make a request and we get 53. And no matter how many times we call the service, we get 53. And this makes sense because currently what we have is we have the numbers service and the numbers client both as singleton, meaning that the numbers service and the numbers client will be created once for the entire application. And then we have, let's say this rectangle is the numbers client and this rectangle is the numbers service. This block is what will be returned every single time someone requests the numbers service. So even though the controller is transient and the outer box keeps changing, the internal numbers service and numbers client will always be the same. So now the question is, why doesn't it matter if I change this to transient? So like I said before, it doesn't matter if you decide to register it as transient or singleton, because if we go ahead and run the application again, then you'll see that again, we get the exact same number all the time. The answer is the following. So we have over here the controller, let's say controller, and that this is transient. And the controller uses the numbers service, which is a singleton, right? So we have the numbers service, which is a singleton. And finally, the numbers service has a dependency on the numbers client, so that's a numbers client, which is a transient service. Now, here's where it becomes interesting. So we have the dependency injection IOC container, and the framework tells the dependency IOC container, please give me an instance of the controller. The dependency injection IOC container says, no problem. It goes ahead and creates a brand new controller because the controller is transient. When it tries to resolve the dependency of the number service, then it looks and it sees that the numbers service is singleton. So it goes ahead, and because this is the first request, it generates a brand new number service. But when it tries to create a brand new number service, it sees that it has a dependency on the numbers client. So it goes ahead and it creates a numbers client. Now, because it's transient, then every single time someone requests a numbers client, then it'll generate a brand new numbers client. So the first request is in, and we created this block over here where the numbers service from now on, every time the controller requests a numbers service, this entire block is what will be returned. And because this numbers client, even though it's transient, it's inside the singleton, then whatever number was generated in the beginning, I think it was 56, then this is the number that will always be returned back to the client. And what we actually did over here is we violated the lifetime of the numbers client. Because we have this singleton object, which will be created once and returned throughout the lifetime of the application, and we put inside it the numbers client, which is transient, and now we captured this transient service inside a singleton service, and it won't behave as intended. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So again, this will be created once, this will be created every single time, but because we're creating this once, then we're capturing the numbers client, the first one that was generated, we're storing it inside the numbers service, and now this is what will be returned. Now I want you to think, what will be the output if we change this to be transient and we change this to be singleton? So this should be pretty obvious by this stage. So the numbers client, because this is the one that's actually generating the number, because this is a singleton, then this will only have one instance throughout the lifetime of our application. And this number that was generated in the first time is what will be returned throughout the lifetime of the application, meaning that it doesn't matter if this is transient, because this over here is a singleton, then the same number will always be returned. Okay, now let's talk about the last lifetime, which is scoped. So for this, let's say we have the following thing. Let's say in the numbers client, instead of every time generating a new number, let's say that in the beginning this is 0. Let's change this not to be read-only. And let's introduce here a new method called, let's say, increment. So let's say increment. And this method will increment the number by 1. Okay, so hopefully you see where I'm going with this. So we have the numbers client. Now we have this instance in which we can go ahead and we can call increment and increment the underlying number. Now what I want us to do is I want us to go to the numbers controller, and alongside the service, I want us to inject the numbers client. So I'll say numbers client and numbers client. And what I want us to do over here is say numbers client, and let's increment the count over here. And in the program CS, just reminding what we have. So the number service will be generated every time a new instance, but the numbers client, we're going to have one throughout the lifetime of the application. So now, because we have only one numbers client, every time we call the API, then we're expecting to increase the number by one, because again, it lives throughout the entire application. We have this one instance of the numbers client class, and every time when we call the endpoint, then we're increasing the number, and that's why it goes up every time. Of course, if I go ahead and change this to be transient instead, so let's say add transient. So now they're both transient and the numbers client will be generated every time it's requested. So because also the controller, also the service, and also the client are transient, then every time we make a request, we generate brand new objects of all three. And that's why in the numbers controller, when we go ahead and we request the numbers client over here, it's not going to be the same instance over here that it is inside the numbers service. So when we request the numbers client over here, then we're generating a brand new numbers client and we expect the number to stay 0. So to test this out, let's go ahead and make a few requests and we can see that indeed the number is always 0. Now, if we want throughout the lifetime of a single request to reuse the same instance, then we can use scoped. So we can say for the numbers client, instead of it being transient, we can go ahead and say add scoped. And the behavior of scoped is similar to Singleton. So right with a Singleton, then in the first time we request an instance of that type, then it creates a brand new one and it stores it internally and returns the same instance all the time. In scoped, it's the same behavior, but only for a single request. So in the lifetime of a single request, in the first time, it'll generate a numbers client. And from then on, every single time throughout the lifetime of this request, when someone requests the numbers client, then it'll go ahead and return the same instance. Meaning that now in the numbers controller, when we request over here the numbers client, this numbers client and this numbers client is going to be the same instance. Meaning that we expect the value now to be 1 because for each request, we're creating a new numbers client, we're incrementing the number from 0 to 1, and we're returning it from the service. So rerunning the service, and now we see that we always get the output 1. Okay, so that's scoped, transient, and Singleton. Now, going back to the program CS, if we go ahead and we replace this to be scoped and this to be transient, what do you think will be the output? So again, I'm changing this to be scoped. I'm changing this to be transient. What do you think will be the output now? Hopefully by now you should be able to guess what the output will be. So we make the request and we see that it's 0 because the number that was incremented in the controller isn't the numbers client that's stored inside the numbers service, but it's a different instance altogether because this over here is generated every single time someone requests a numbers client. Okay, now just to illustrate this further, so let's say over here that this is scoped again, meaning that we return the same instance all the time within the lifetime of a single request. Now, if we go over here and we add some middleware, let's say use, and let's say we have over here the HTTP context and the next delegate, and we go ahead and we resolve the numbers client. So we go ahead and say HTTP context dot request services and get required service of type numbers client. So now we have the client over here and we can go ahead and say client dot increment. Okay, now that we have this, then we expect the client resolved over here from the dependency injection IOC container to be the same instance that we're resolving also in the numbers controller. So this should be the same one, which means we're incrementing the number twice. And then we're getting the exact same instance also in the number service, which means that the number we expect to see is 2. So we make the request and we see that indeed the output is 2. So I hope you're starting to get the intuition into why you don't want to capture inside a service with a longer lifetime, a service with a shorter lifetime. Because once it captures the object or the service with a shorter lifetime, then that's what will be returned. And it doesn't matter how you defined the service in the dependency injection IOC container, because the object with the longer lifetime is what will be returned. Okay, now that we're familiar with all of this and you have already a pretty good intuition for how things work, let's real quick go over all the various other methods that you need to be familiar with. So you know transient, scoped, and Singleton, but we always registered the actual concrete type, the actual implementation, and not an interface. Now, if you remember when we talked about the dependency inversion principle in the previous video, we said that larger components or modules shouldn't depend on smaller components or modules, but instead they should rely on some abstraction. So we don't really want the numbers controller over here to rely on the concrete types of the numbers service and the numbers client because we're coupling the numbers controller with these specific implementations. Now, perhaps for the numbers controller, it's a bit less relevant, this argument, because you'll anyway write end-to-end tests or integration tests and unit tests. If your system is built correctly, then it shouldn't be too important. But in the numbers service, if when we want to go ahead and write unit tests for this, then we want to put a different implementation of the numbers client for unit tests. So we don't want to go ahead and make the API call to the numbers API, but instead we want to mock this somehow. Then currently we can't go ahead and replace the numbers client because the numbers client is already the type. So instead, what you'll often see is that we won't have the numbers client registered, but we'll have also a INumbers client. And this will be the interface for getting a number. So this is going to be get number. And then the numbers client will go ahead and implement this interface. Let's say INumbers client. Of course, we also need the increment method. So let's go ahead and add this as well. And then in the numbers service, then we'll no longer rely on the type, but instead we'll rely on the interface. Same thing for the controller. So let's change this from being the numbers client to being the INumbers client. And now that we have this, then we can no longer have only this, because when the numbers service will be initialized or created, instantiated by the dependency injection IOC container, it won't know how to generate the INumbers client. It'll know how to generate the numbers client, but not the INumbers client. So over here is our chance to say, when someone requests the INumbers client, then go ahead and provide or return use the implementation of this class. What this means is that you can go ahead and say, let's say builder.environment, and based on different environments to inject different services to your dependency injection IOC container and control which objects or which types will be returned for different environments. Okay, so this is what you'll usually see. And the way you read it is inside the dependency injection IOC container, we're defining the configuration that when someone requests an INumbers client interface, then return an object of type numbers client. Do I go ahead and create a brand new numbers client, or do I reuse a numbers client that was already created in the beginning of the application or the beginning of the request? That depends on the lifetime. If it's transient, then it'll create a brand new numbers client. If it's scoped, then it'll create a brand new numbers client only if it's the first time within the lifetime of the request. And if it's singleton, then only if it's the first time throughout the lifetime of the entire application. Okay, now let's talk about multiple registrations. So let's imagine that we have over here the numbers client, and let's change this to be, instead of the numbers client, let's call it the number 3 client, and this will go ahead and return simply the number 3. So let's say 3 from over here. Let's get rid of this increment also over here and also in the controller. And alongside this number 3 client, let's duplicate this, and let's say that we also have the number 5 client. And in the numbers service, then still let's request only the INumbers client. Now what we're going to do is in the program CS, we won't register the number 3 client, but we'll register both the number 3 client and the number 5 client. Now for simplicity, let's go ahead and comment the entire middleware out because I removed the increment method. Okay, so again, what we have is we're registering both the number 3 and the number 5, but in the numbers service, we're requesting specifically the numbers client. So now if we go ahead and run the application, what do you think will be the output? Will this throw an exception? Will it return the number 3? Will it return the number 5? Or maybe something else altogether? So your time to think ends now. And as you can see, we get the number 5, meaning that the service used is only the last service registered. So if we went ahead and we registered 3 again afterwards, then the number that will be returned now is the number 3. Okay, now if you want to get all the services that were registered for this type, then you can go ahead and do the following thing. Let's change this from being the INumbers client to being some collection of the number client. Let's say over here enumerable, but this can also be list or something else. And now instead of saying get number, let's say that this is no longer the number client, but it's the number clients, we can go ahead and say sum. And for each one of the clients, let's go ahead and call get number. And what this will do is it'll take the two clients that we have, the 3 and the 5, it'll sum the numbers together, and we expect the output to be 8. And actually it's not 8, because if you remember, then we registered 3 again afterwards. Then what happens behind the scenes is that the dependency injection IOC container contains a mapping between a type and a list of implementations. In our case, we specified that we want the number 3, the number 5, and the number 3, meaning that in the numbers service, we'll get a collection of size 3. When we call get number, then we'll return 3, 5, and 3, and summing everything together, we have 11. If you want to register multiple implementations for a specific type, so we have the numbers client and we want to register it both as 3 and as 5, but later we want to get specifically the 3 or specifically the 5, then instead of adding it like so, we can say keyed scope, and over here we can specify some key. So for the 3, let's say 3, and for the 5, let's say 5. And now we're adding to the dependency injection IOC container a keyed service where we can go ahead and specify the key and get that specific service. So in the numbers controller, let's say we have here 2 endpoints. Now we have the get number 3 and the get number 5. And now what we can do is, let's say that over here we're calling the INumbers client. We can go ahead and specify over here from keyed services and specify that we want the client that returns 3. Now, because we also need the 3 and the 5, so let's go ahead and call this number 3 client. And alongside this, let's create another one, which will be the number 5 client. And let's change this to be 5. And once we have that, then in the get number 3 endpoint, we can say number 3 client. And over here, we can change this to be the number 5 client. Then, of course, the last thing we need to do is differentiate between the routes. So let's say over here that this is 3 and that this is 5. So now if we go ahead and say 3 and we make the request, then we get 3. But if we say 5, then we get the number 5. Now, you're familiar with dependency injection, but for some reason you never saw this add keyed method before, then that's because this was introduced in .NET 8. So before .NET 8, you don't have the option to say add keyed scope. And instead, what you would need to do in this case is say add scoped, and then in the controller, you need to request all the various implementations. So this would need to be IEnumerable of INumber client. And this won't be the number 3 client, but it will be all the number clients. And then over here, you would need to go ahead and say number clients. And over here, you would want the single one where the type is number 3. And similarly, over here, you would want to get the single one, which is the number 5 client. And now it should behave the same thing like before. So we have 5 and we have 3 as well. Okay, so it's not that it wasn't possible before, but now it's just a bit simpler. Now it's worth noting also the following few methods. So similar to all the various methods of add scope, that transient, etc., we also have the try version of it, where what happens is the following. Actually, let me demonstrate this. So in the numbers controller, let's change this back to a few iterations back. Okay, so I reverted back to the state in which we simply have the controller calling the service, and the service is going ahead and calling the client, where the client is returning a number, where this number can be either 5 or 3 depending on what implementation we're registering. Now, as we already know, then if we didn't have the try, then the last registration is what will be returned when requesting a single service. So if we go ahead and leave it like this, then the output, like we saw before, is going to be 5. If we change this to TryAdd, then the registration is optimistic. So it will only register the service in the dependency injection IOC container if a configuration doesn't already exist for this type. Because we're already adding a configuration over here, then this will fail. And what we expect to get in the output is the number 3. Okay, so the try is the optimistic version of adding the service to the dependency injection IOC container. And this exists for all of the various extension methods. So you can also say TryAdd keyed scope and TryAdd keyed singleton and TryAdd singleton, etc., etc. Everything exists with the keyed and the try versions. And there's also the raw method, which is simply add. Then you need to specify over here the service descriptor, where this service descriptor is a pretty simple object. I'll say service descriptor. Let's initialize this, where what we need to specify over here is the type. So I'll say type of and INumbers client. And we want the implementation of this to be the, let's say, 3 client. And the lifetime that we want it to have is Singleton. So over here, we have the service type being the INumbers client, the implementation type being the number 3 client, and the lifetime being Singleton. Once we have this, then we can go ahead and say add and pass it the service descriptor. And now this block over here is equivalent to saying builder.services.add Singleton and specifying that for the INumbers client, let's copy this thing, we want the number 3 client, okay? So this thing is equivalent to this entire thing. And the really last method that you're probably never going to use is the TryAddEnumerable. So if we go ahead, let's demonstrate it. So let me get rid of this entire thing. So now all we're doing is we're registering the number 3, then we're registering the number 5, and finally let's go ahead and register the number 3 again. Also, let's get rid of the try and simply call addScoped. Now, because we're not calling try, then not only the first one takes place, but all 3 of these are registered in the dependency injection IOC container, which means that because in the numbers service, we're requesting a single numbers client, then what we expect to be returned is the number 3 client and eventually the number 3. So if we go ahead and run the application and we make a request, then we can see that indeed the last one that was registered is what caught. But if we want a uniqueness inside the list of INumber clients stored inside the dependency injection IOC container, so once the number 3 was registered, we don't want to register again, then we can go ahead and say TryAddEnumerable, and instead of calling it like this, we need to revert back to the raw form. So let's take this service descriptor, put it over here, and like we said, we want this to be the numbers client. This will be the number 3 client. The lifetime, we want it to be scoped. And now if we go ahead and put this over here, then this will guarantee the uniqueness in which we have only the number 3 client and the number 5 client, but we don't have it twice. Meaning that if we go ahead and make the request again, then the last registration shouldn't take place. And what we expect to be returned is 5. If we go to the numbers service and we change this to be a collection again, and let's say we're summing the numbers, same thing like we did before. So let's say sum, and for the client, let's call getNumber and sum this, then we don't expect the number to be 11 like before, but because we only have 1 of each type, then we expect the output to be 8. So let's go ahead and call this, and as expected, we get 8. Okay, so this means that no matter how many calls we had over here, none of these would register the number 3 because we have it defined over here. If we remove this, then only the first one will add the number 3, but the rest won't add it because we're guaranteeing uniqueness inside the collection. So that's a pretty quick overview of the various methods, probably more or less everything that you need to know to work with dependency injection in your applications. If you want the source code, then make sure to check out the Patreon. If you're interested in my courses, then make sure to check out my courses. And of course, don't go anywhere without smashing the like button, and I'll see you in the next one.